Gotta swing it. Oh yeah, there we go. There we go. Oop. Hello everyone, I'm Joey from Lock Props. Today I will be showing you how to make Tengen's blades from Demon Slayer. Tengen is known as the Sound Hashira. He has heightened sense of hearing, he is able to move pretty much at the speed of sound, and is able to make attacks that create a loud, thunderous sound. His personality is very flashy, like the blades he uses, which are Nichiren blades connected to each other by a chain, resembling nunchucks. This character also caused a huge stir with the antagonist of the second season, so at first, even though I wasn't a fan of him, by the end of it, I was. And if you wanted to make these yourselves, the tools, materials, and blueprint links are down in the description below for my Etsy shop and affiliate links. You support the channel by using those links, so thank you. This build took me a while, so I recommend making both of them at the same time to save time. Let's get started. First, we're going to start off with the template. I cut the template where the lines are, and then I tape them together. Just for added support, I add tape to the other side as well. To cut this template out, I used my razor blade. For right now, we're going to go ahead and put this aside. We'll get back to this later. Here is the basic shape of what the sword is going to look like. We're going to start off with the blade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the template in half where the sword meets the handle. For the main body of the blade, I use 6mm high density EVA foam. I grabbed some paperweights so then that way the template doesn't come up while I'm tracing it out. Remember, since we are doing 2 blades, make sure that you do this 4 times. When cutting the sword out of the foam, make sure that you cut on the outside line of the Sharpie. This way we can sand it down later and it won't cut in too deep. For the cutout in the middle of the blade, I highly recommend using the X-Acto blade for that. Now that I have all 4 pieces, I need to now figure out what I'm going to use as support in the middle of the blade. I have 2 5mm carbon fiber rods for the support. I marked the support just about where the pommel is. The length that I had to cut for the carbon fiber rod was about 29 inches or 736.5 millimeters. I went to the scroll saw to cut this where I marked. If you don't have a scroll saw, you might have to use some wire cutters. I placed the foam on top of the template so then that way I can line the support with the pommel. I hold down the support and I trace around it. I flip the template over so then that way I can do the same with the other side. Since I needed to see the pommel line, I cut the template in half, flipped the handle around, and then I taped it together again. There are many different ways that you can make this trench, but I'm going to show you the different ways that I have done it in the past. Coming at a 45-degree angle, you just want to score slightly into the foam and drag it all the way down. Then, you'll flip it around and do the same to the other side. The downside to this method is that if you go too far, you will see it on the other side, and the other side will be able to fold very easily. If you have a Dremel and the router accessory, you can actually carve out the trench by using that. I personally feel that it's a lot cleaner this method, and you also don't go as deep because you can adjust the height however way you want. But recently I did just upgrade and I got an actual router and I'm going to test it out for the first time now. Just as I thought, this was a lot easier. But the dust does get everywhere, so be sure to wear your respirator when you're doing this. Now that they're all trenched out, I need to now glue them together. I started using contact cement, but then about halfway through the first blade, my hand got a huge cramp. So then I switched over and used a spray adhesive. And boy, I tell you, that was so much faster. I did about 2 coats of this before I started to put them together. I laid down the carbon fiber rod. When I was ready to put them together, I put on some gloves because these are really sticky. When putting it down, I actually look at the trench up at the top, so then that way I can lay it down right on top of the support beam. Once both pieces are put together, now we can go ahead and start trimming it down. There's a bit of overlap, so we're going to have to cut out and also sand down the edges. I try and cut as much as I can with my X-Acto blade or my razor blade, because then the more material that I leave behind, the more I have to sand, and then the more mess it makes when I go to sand later. For the edge cleaning, I use a high grit drum and I put it on my Dremel, so then that way I can sand it down. Remember to always sand away from yourself. While you're sanding and you get near the tip of the blade, that's when you rotate it around, because if you keep going to the very edge, it will actually roll over to the other side and possibly might damage the side of the blade. Then I do the light sanding of all the corners of the blade. Next, we need to add the edge detail on the side. I'll cut it out by using my X-Acto blade because curves with the X-Acto blade are very easy. I lay the piece of the template on top of the EVA foam and I trace it out with the Sharpie. Don't forget, there's 2 swords, so make sure you do this for each side and on each blade. But the nice thing is that you only need 1 template because you can just flip it around for the other side. To help protect the Sharpie line, I used this 6mm masking tape and I began tracing around the line that I just made. For sanding down the edge, you can either use sandpaper, a Dremel, or if you happen to have a belt sander, I found that this saved so much time. Once I got the edge down enough, I grabbed my orbital sander and put 1000 grit sandpaper on it, and then I started sanding it down even further. After all the sanding, I sealed the foam by using my heat gun. I feel like the masking tape really helps keeping a clean line for your blade's edge. Remember that thing I told you to put away? Go ahead and take it out now. So we'll go ahead and grab the template and we'll cut it out. For the main body of the handle, I used the same 6mm foam that I used for the blade. I traced it out with my Sharpie and began cutting it out with the X-Acto blade. For the indented corners, I felt like it was best to actually stab in the middle of the inside of it and work outward. After the basic shape was done, I go back to the template and cut out the outside trim. Using 2mm EVA foam, I trace this out 4 times. Then I cut out each piece, but I did also remember to cut on the outside line of the Sharpie. I did a test piece and it looks like we're right on track. Just so I didn't waste any foam, I used the same 2mm foam that I had actually cut out the outside trim. Now for the other pieces of the trim, I went ahead and began tracing it out using the X-Acto blade. I cut out the cross section of the template and traced it out on the foam. This handle is elongated, so make sure that the top and bottom are in their own places as well as the left and right sides. That's why I cut it straight down the middle so the north and south parts are together as one, and then the sides are completely separate. Now we can start layering. We took the outside trim pieces and used super glue to glue it around the outside. I ran out of super glue that day, so I switched over to contact cement. Still worked. Now I have to glue the top and bottom pieces. Sometimes they don't fit exactly, so I have to cut them in half. I got more super glue and glued them down. Now it's okay if it looks a little lopsided or it looks a little funky right in the middle, but the blade is going to cover that up. Next we need to cut out the trim that goes in a circle. I grabbed one of the corner pieces that was left over and cut it out. When tracing this out, I used the Sharpie thickness as the actual thickness of that piece. This was probably the most tedious portion of the guard because you had to make this 16 times. Good news though, you only have to do the template 1 time because you can actually flip it over and it will make up one of the other corners that you need. For very thin detail like this, it's almost impossible to not use super glue for this. Using contact cement will just get all over your fingers. So once I was ready, I began piecing it all together. Remember when I said to cut on the outside part of the Sharpie line? So now we're going to go ahead and sand down the edges and the corners. I grabbed my drill and made a hole right in the middle of the guard. When drilling the hole, I do recommend to make it a little bit smaller, that way the support fits in snug and doesn't move around a lot. Oh, we're almost done with the body. Now we'll take the handle piece of the template. Using the same 6mm foam, we're going to go ahead and trace this out 4 times. As always, I trace on the outside of the Sharpie line. I need to make a trench for the handle too. So I bring the blade body over, but I do actually have it offset a little bit just because of the guard. I traced it out and then I use my router to cut out that trench. On a side note, I did notice the spray adhesive was starting to come apart where the end of the seam line was. So then I grabbed some EVA foam clay and some water and turned it into a very light paste and began filling in those seam lines. Once it was fully dry, I sanded it down lightly with 400 grit sandpaper. Alright, back to the handle. For this part, since the handle is very thin and small, I decided to use the contact cement for this part instead of the spray adhesive. Also, whenever I use contact cement, I use 2 layers of it. So I'll apply 1 coat, I wait about 5 minutes, and then I'll apply a second coat. This way, once I piece them together, they are not coming apart. In this case, instead of putting contact cement everywhere, I ended up not putting it in the trench. That way I can work on the handle and the blade separately. Same process as the blade, I used the trench and the support to make sure that I have everything lined up. I cut off the excess and then I started sanding down the edges. This took me a while to get it pretty rounded, so be patient with it. To get rid of all the small fuzzies from the sanding, I grabbed a 1000 grit sandpaper and just cleaned it up. Now that I have the handle, the guard, and the blades, I'm ready to plasti dip. I put the handle and the guard on a tray and put the blades onto some plank with a hole in it, so then that way I can plasti dip both sides. Normally when I plasti dip, I do about 3 to 4 coats. Next I need to paint the orange onto the blade. Since I'm still able to see the defined line in the foam, I did the exact same thing as before and used the masking tape to trace along that line. Since the rest of the blade stays black, I need to cover it up with some frog tape. So I got a lot of the yellow frog tape and taped up everywhere on this thing that was not going to be orange. Trust me, it's always better to over tape in these areas just to make sure that you don't have to go back over and repaint everything again. Once everything was taped up, I grabbed Rust-Oleum Real Orange paint. I do an extremely light coat at first, wait about a minute, and then I sprayed on the rest of it. Some areas of the guard are the same orange, so I decided to just paint the whole thing orange. After about 20 minutes of drying, I decided to start peeling off. I didn't want it to fully cure because then I had to worry about it peeling up the rest of the orange, and then I wouldn't have this clean line. I always have to be very careful about where I put this tape because I have put it back on the prop before and then it peeled up the paint that I just did. I put the swords and the guard on the plank and decided to just wait for it to fully cure. Using 6mm Tamiya masking tape, I traced the very edge of the blade. I'm using this as the thickness for the very edge of the blade. This is going to be the really shiny part. Once I was done taping that section, I actually butted another piece of tape right next to it. Once they're sitting right next to each other, I end up peeling off the very edge of the piece, leaving the perfect line all the way up and down the blade. Frog tape stays in business because of me, I swear. I end up using more frog tape to tape up the rest of the blade, so then that way I can paint on the silver edge. Okay, so I used frog tape for just the delicate areas, but for the areas that is just all plasti dip, I can use normal masking tape for that, and it won't tear up the plasti dip. For that edge, I decided to go with the Montana Silver Chrome paint. The downside about this paint, from what I've noticed, is that even after days of spraying it on, if I happen to hit the two swords together, the silver will actually come off and make a mark on the other blade, especially on the black plasti dip. Then I can't get it off. So if you want to at this point, I would probably recommend doing a gloss top coat on here, but downside is that it will take away some of that shine. In the video, this is where I did not top coat, and I had to go back in later off camera and retape up everything and then apply a top coat. Now we can paint on the kanji on the side of the blades. Using the Liquitex heavy body paint, I used the iridescent rich gold and watered it down for this paint. I mixed it around until it had the consistency of milk. Then I began tracing out what the kanji looks like. I noticed that in the anime it's only on the outside edges of the sword, so if he's holding it in his right hand, the kanji is only on the right side. If it's in his left hand, then it's only on the left side. It's not actually on the inside of the blades. But hey, less work for me to do. Even with the heavy body acrylics, I noticed that one layer was not enough. So once everything was dried, I went over everything again with the same gold. While that was drying, I decided to start painting the guard. Using Liquitex Basics Cadmium Red, I began layering on top of the orange. I had to do at least 3 layers, so again, be patient. For the outside trim, I did a few layers of the Hooker's Green. Once it was fully done, I sprayed it with a matte finish. But the guard looked a little too clean for me, so I ended up using a dark color like this ivory black and added some water to make a wash, and then I put it in all the nooks and crannies of it and wiped it off immediately. That way it left over just a little bit of the black. Once they were dried, I set them in a safe area, and then I needed to paint the handle. For this color, I decided to go with the greenery Montana paint. Once it was dried, I put a matte finish on it. For the pommel of the blade, I grabbed the same 6mm foam that we've been using the entire time for the blade, and I laid the template on top of the foam. I traced out 2 for each side for each blade, so I had to do this 4 times. I cut them out with my razor blade, and then I put on 2 layers of barge cement. I also put 2 layers where they were going to go. When gluing these on, I made sure to line up the bottom part. That's going to be very important for later when we wrap the handle. Before I forget, let's go ahead and add in this detail. For this, I decided to go with 4mm EVA foam, and then cut out about 1/2 inch foam strips. I would recommend to cut out maybe 3 or 4 of these. I take one of the foam strips and wrap it all the way around the handle to see where I need to cut. I make my mark, and then cut. If I want this trim piece to wrap around the handle perfectly, I'm going to have to cut the edges at a slant. Using my ruler, I'll butt it at the very edge of it, and then with a 45-degree angle, I'll make a cut into the foam. That way it has a slant on one side, but the other side I have to do the opposite for it. By that, I'll flip it around and then turn it upside down and then do the exact same thing. Once they're cut and ready to go, I plasti dipped and then painted them the same orange. I applied contact cement to the back of the pieces, as well as to the handle, making sure that the 2 cuts that I did line up correctly. Now we need to drill a hole in the pommel. I cut the hole out of the template, then laid the template on top of the foam and traced it with my Sharpie. Using a 9/18 spade bit, I used my drill and drilled out the hole. In order not to damage my workspace, I grabbed a wooden plank and then used that as protection for my desk. After I drilled out the hole, I grabbed my Dremel and cleaned up on the inside. I also sanded down the very edges and corners of the hole. After layering on 2 coats of the barge cement in this area right here, I grabbed that same 1/2-inch EVA foam strip and laid it on the inside. Any extra that was at the end, I trimmed it down with my X-Acto blade. It's a little rough, but we can clean that up. Using the Dremel, I sanded down the edges to make it more rounded, as well as any kind of giant lumps in the foam. To make everything a little even, I grabbed some more foam clay and some water and did a light layer all the way around. Remember how I said before you needed at least 3 to 4 of those 1/2-inch strips of EVA foam? That's because we also have to add the same trim to the blade. Same process as the handle, I'll go ahead and wrap around the blade and then make my mark, and then from there I'll make my cut. Once the paint was done for this trim, we are now going to go ahead and glue it on. Same process as the handle, we did 2 layers of barge cement on the trim as well as the blade itself and began wrapping it around. This time though, I actually thought about the seam line and I put it on the bottom so then that way it wouldn't be seen. If it starts to come undone, just apply a little bit of super glue and you should be good. For the details on the pommel, I grabbed 2mm EVA foam and cut out 1/4 inch strips. I'll have the template right next to the piece that I'm working on, so then that way I can start placing it down. Once I feel like the trim is in the right area, I use my X-Acto blade to make a small little indent where I'm going to cut. Then I'll use super glue to get that piece started. I butt another piece right next to the one I just made, and then I make a mark. That way they're exactly the same. I put the joining piece on the inside and make my mark and cut it out. I make sure that I do the square on both sides first before I do the final trim at the bottom. That way I can trace it from one end over to the other and it's perfect. You can use foam clay to clean up these seam lines and make it look like it's all one piece. Next, I use frog tape to tape down the rest of the handle except for the pommel, because now we're going to plasti dip it. Since the pommel is more of a gold, I use this Rub and Buff Grecian Gold to be the outside of the pommel. I grabbed a cheap brush that I knew I was not going to be using anymore, and then I wiped most of it off on a paper towel. Then I began just adding layers onto the pommel. Now we can wrap the handle. I bought 2 of these wraps because I knew that one wasn't going to be enough if I were to just cut it in half and try and wrap both handles. If you've seen some of my other videos, this will be very familiar for you. So we'll find the halfway point of the wrap. That's our beginning point. I'll put some super glue at the very top of the handle, then rest the middle of that cord until it's set. Now we'll rotate it to the other side and begin. The process for this is that you take the left side and you rotate it up twice. Then you'll take the right side and lay it over the left, and then you'll twist up twice on that same side. Sometimes you might have to super glue in those areas just to keep them held down. To be honest, that's what I had to do. So you'll just repeat that same pattern by going over to the left, rotating up twice, bringing the right side over, then rotate up twice on that side. Then you'll rotate to the other side and repeat. When I get to the very end, I just use super glue to glue everything down. Sometimes you have to cut off the excess in order for it to glue down properly, and I'll find the length that I like and then cut it down into a slant. I'll use a lighter to singe off the ends so then that way they don't fray, and then tuck it into this section right here. I'll apply a last bit of super glue to keep it from coming out. Now it's assembly time. We will slide the guard up to the blade. I applied some super glue onto the blade as well as the guard where it's going to sit. Before I put on the handle though, I wanted to put on this round carabiner onto the end of the pommel. Luckily, it was just big enough to fit.
That's what she said!
Then I put some more super glue onto the support beam, as well as on the inside of the handle. Then I slid the handle on. So now the body is done. But one last thing, he does have a chain that links them together. I measured this chain to about 4 feet. I grabbed my pliers and cut one of the links off. I slipped the ends of the chain into the carabiner and now I'm done. Wish I could say I made these at the speed of sound, but I would be lying if I said that. These blades are really unique and great for any collection or for cosplay. I will have these blades for sale in the link below if you don't want to make your own. But if you got value out of this video, please like and subscribe and comment and tell me what you want me to make, since the suggestions and support are what keep this channel going. As for my next build, I will be making Zoro's blades from One Piece. So, when the first sword video comes out, I will leave it right here for you, so then that way you can watch that now. Oh, hello, my lady. It seems that you have been eyeing my Nichiren blades. Oh, you have fine taste. Do you know that they are from Demon Slayer? You don't know what Demon Slayer is? Oh, then get away from me, you peasant, because you do not deserve my time. I am so upset, I'm gonna go wear my fedora now.
気持ち悪いやつだな。